Nobody in Weatherby expected Harlan Beck to lift his hand that morning. The auction had been dragging on since sunrise, out in the muddy back lot of the old Renner place in Colwyn County, and by the time Amos Pell got around to the shape under the tarp at the far end of the yard, half the crowd had already drifted off toward the coffee urn and the pie table. What stayed behind was the rusted hulk that nobody had driven out to buy. Amos Pell, a lean, fast-talking auctioneer with a gavel and a dented derby, walked around it twice like a man circling a sleeping bull, and even he seemed unsure of what to call it. It stood taller than a man. A huge horse-drawn steam fire engine, its boiler stack rising up black as a factory chimney. Its tall iron wheels sunk 2 full inches into the spring mud. 6 decades of weather had turned the whole machine the color of dried blood, rust red and flaking, the brass gone green and brown, the leather hose cracked into useless strips. Somebody had scrawled a single word across a barn shingle and leaned it against the front axle so there would be no confusion about the lot. Scrap. The good things had already sold that day. The Renner tractors had gone before 10, and the hay rake and the good cattle panels and a walnut sideboard 3 families had fought over politely. The crowd that was left was the crowd that stays for the leavings, the pickers and the scrap men and the folks who came mostly to see who else came. So when Amos tipped back his derby and said, "Well, who'll start me on the iron?" the only answer was the wind and a cattle dealer clearing his throat. Over by the fence, Dale Corbin, a man in his 50s in a warm mustard-tan jacket and dark trousers, laughed out loud, the kind of laugh a man makes to be sure it carries. "You would have to pay me to haul that home, Amos. There is not $5 of good metal left in her, and it would cost you 10 to cut it out." The crowd chuckled along with him because Dale Corbin was a man people chuckled with, and Amos Pell shrugged and looked ready to knock the whole ruin down for scrap weight and be done with it. He lifted the gavel. Last call, then, for the $45. Every head in the yard turned. Harlan Beck, a weathered older man in his 60s in blue denim bib overalls over a work shirt and a pale straw hat, stood near the back with one hand already resting on the engine's cold brass rail, the way a man rests a hand on a horse he has made up his mind to keep. For a moment, there was pure silence. Then the laughter came, and this time it was louder. Somebody hollered that Harlan had finally gone soft in the head. A picker asked if he meant $45 or 45 cents. Dale Corbin turned clean around, his mouth falling open in a scoffing, incredulous grin. 45? Harlan, for $45 you could buy a running truck and a tank of gas to put in it. Harlan did not look at him. 45, he said again, quiet as a man saying grace. Sold, Amos Pell said, before the fool could come to his senses, to Harlan Beck. And the Lord watch over him. He tied a little yellow paper tag to the brass rail, the price inked on it in his own hand, plain as day, $45. An old-timer leaning on the fence, one of the very few who had not been laughing, spoke up to nobody in particular. "I saw that engine work one time, when I was no higher than the wheel hub. She threw water 90 feet straight up that night, right over the courthouse cupola, and put out a fire the whole town had given up for lost. Prettiest and most terrible thing I ever did see." Nobody believed him. That machine had not thrown so much as a drop in 30 years, and looking at her sunk there in the cold mud, it was impossible to imagine that she ever had. Harlan believed him. He did not say so. He just counted out his $45 in soft, worn bills, borrowed a team and a low flatbed off the Renner estate, and spent the better part of the afternoon getting the great dead engine loaded and chained, while half the county watched and grinned and offered advice nobody wanted. By the time he hauled her up the lane to his place at the edge of town, the word had already run ahead of him, the way word does in a place like Weatherby. Ada Beck, a soft-spoken woman in her 60s with silver hair pinned back and a flour-dusted apron, came out onto the porch, wiping her hands, and stood a long moment looking at the rusted mountain of iron her husband had backed up to the barn. $45, she said. It was not quite a question. $45, Harlan agreed. Ada looked at it a while longer. She had been married to the man for going on 40 years, and somewhere in those years she had learned the difference between his foolish quiet and his certain quiet. This was the certain kind. "Then I expect you had better make her worth it," she said, and went back inside to see about supper. The town was less kind and a good deal less private about it. For a solid week, Harlan Beck's $45 folly was the best free entertainment in Colwyn County. Men found reasons to drive past the Beck place slow. At the feed store and the barber's chair, they wondered aloud whether he meant to plant petunias in her boiler or keep laying hens in the works. Dale Corbin told the story of the auction at least a dozen times, each telling a little taller than the last, until in the final and finest version, Harlan had practically fought a bidding war against his own self to overpay for a heap of rust. Harlan let them talk. He had spent his whole life in Weatherby being underestimated, and he had come to find it a rather peaceful place to live. Every morning, before the heat of the day came up, he walked out to the barn, laid his hand on the cold brass rail, and studied the machine the way a country doctor studies a patient nobody else expects to pull through. Whatever the town believed, he was not a foolish man. He had grown up around engines and boilers, had kept a threshing rig running through 2 hard decades, and could read cast iron the way other men read weather. And the more he looked, the more certain he became of a thing he could not yet prove. Under all that ruin, the bones of her were sound. He knew he could not do it alone, though, and there was only one man in the county who might have the knowledge for the boiler. Grady Shaw. A wiry, soot-stained old boiler man with white stubble and thick forearms had spent 40 years firing locomotives before his knees finally gave out, and now spent most of his days in a chair on his porch being cantankerous at the weather. When Harlan drove out and told him what he wanted, Grady laughed harder than anyone at the auction had. But he came. Curiosity got the better of the old boiler man, and the morning he first walked slow around the engine, his laugh dried up in his throat. He ran a scarred thumb along a boiler seam. He thumped the shell with the flat of his hand and cocked his head, listening to the ring of it the way another man might listen for a heartbeat. "They built her right," Grady admitted, and he sounded almost angry to have to say it. "This here is real iron, poured thick. Nobody pours iron like this anymore, and nobody could afford to." Then he swung open the firebox door, looked into the cold, dead dark of her belly, and his face went grave. "But she is froze up solid, Harlan, 30 years of standing still. The tubes will be rotted through, the packing has gone to powder, and that pump has not turned over since before the war. I will help you because I am a fool with nothing better to do. But I am telling you now, so you hear it from a friend and not a stranger, she will never breathe again. You are pouring good years after bad." "Maybe," Harlan said. He laid his hand on the brass rail. "We will see." So the work began, and it was brutal, patient, knuckle-splitting work. They started in the fall, and they did not stop through the whole of the winter. Every last bolt on her had rusted into one solid piece with the iron around it, so that freeing a single fitting could eat an entire afternoon of heat and penetrating oil and cursing, with a man's knuckles left raw and bleeding on the cold metal. They drew the boiler tubes one at a time, and found the most of them rotted through, exactly as Grady had promised, and Harlan taught himself to roll new ones in by hand in the lamplight, long after the day's chores were done and Ada had gone up to bed. The great pistons of the steam pump were seized fast in their cylinders. They freed them 1/1000th of an inch at a time, tapping, soaking, waiting, cursing, tapping again, until at last the huge rod slid and the pump turned over with a groan that sounded, Grady swore, exactly like a dying man waking up in a bad mood. There were setbacks that would have broken a softer resolve. One bitter January night of casting, they had labored a fortnight to free cracked clean across under the strain, and Harlan had to carry the broken piece 40 miles to a foundry and pay hard cash he did not have to spare for a new one to be poured to the old pattern. Twice the barn roof leaked snowmelt onto work they had spent days on, and they scraped the fresh rust off and started over without a word between them. But slowly, under Harlan's wire brush and Grady's hard-won skill, the machine began to come up out of the rust. The brass, polished, came up the warm gold of a wheat field at sundown. The boiler, scaled and scraped and blacked, stood proud and dark again. And along her flank, where 60 years of grime had hidden it all, the old painted lettering began, faint and ghostly, to show itself once more. It was there, one gray afternoon in the deep of that winter, that Harlan found the thing that changed everything. He was working a rag into the hardened crust below the engineer's platform, scraping away decade upon decade of filth, when his cloth snagged on a raised edge of metal. He worked at it, spat on it, rubbed, and a small brass presentation plate came up slowly out of the dark, dented, green with corrosion, but readable still. He carried it to the one window and turned it to the thin light. Presented to the town of Weatherby by public subscription of her grateful citizens, it read, and beneath that a single date, 1893. She had not been bought by the town, he understood, standing there in the cold barn with his breath clouding the air in front of him. She had been bought by the people of it, the nickels and dimes and hard dollars of every family in Weatherby pooled together to buy their little town a guardian against the one thing every settlement on that dry prairie feared the most. She was not scrap. She never had been scrap. She had been somebody's promise, cast in iron. If you've made it this far into Harlan Beck's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Harlan started asking questions after that. He asked the old-timers at the barber's. He asked the woman who kept the county records, who let him sit at her table and turn the brittle pages of a subscription ledger from the last century, where in fading brown ink the names of the town's grandfathers were set down beside the coins they had given. He asked Grady, who had come up 2 towns over and remembered more than he ever let on, and slowly, piece by piece, Harlan assembled the story the engine could not tell him herself, the story that Weatherby had spent a whole lifetime working hard not to remember. She had guarded the town faithfully for near 30 years. Then the motor trucks came, the way they came everywhere at last, and a horse-drawn steam engine started to look old-fashioned and dear to keep. The town stopped paying for her upkeep. They let her team of horses go. When a part wore out, no one replaced it. When a fitting was wanted for something else, they simply took it off of her. By the time the worst night finally came, she was already half a ghost, kept on in the fire barn out of habit more than out of any real faith. The worst night was the Corbin fire. It happened in the dry autumn of 1921. The Corbin family ran the grist mill down on the creek. It was their whole living and their whole name in that county, and one still. Rainless night a lamp tipped over in the loft, and the mill went up like a struck match. The men rolled the old steam engine out and lit her fast. But the boiler was slow to build, and the packing leaked, and the pump, half stripped for parts over the lean years, could not hold its pressure. She wheezed and she dribbled, and she did everything in the world but throw water, while the mill and a family's whole living burned down to the water line in the dark, right in front of the men who loved it. There had been a man of 22 on that hose line that night, hauling with everything he had in him, watching his family's name burn down to a bed of embers because the town had let its guardian rot. His name was Dale Corbin. Harlan Beck sat with that knowledge for a long while. He understood now the thing that lived underneath the mockery. When Dale Corbin laughed at the rusted engine in the auction yard, he had not truly been laughing at Harlan at all. He had been laughing at the machine that failed him on the worst night of his life, laughing loud, so that he would not have to do the other thing a man might do. Remembering it, his scorn was 30 years of grief that had learned to wear a grin. And Harlan understood, too, that the work out in his barn had quietly become something a great deal larger than proving a bargain to a town that had laughed at him. If he could make her throw water again, really throw it, the high, hard way she had been built to, then he would not just be redeeming $45 and his own good name, he would be redeeming the broken promise itself. He would be handing the machine back the one thing it had ever been denied, the chance, at long last, to keep its word. Spring came on hard and wet to Colwyn County, and the whole of the work came down to the boiler. Grady would not be hurried on it, not for any money. A boiler that had sat cold and rotting for 30 years could kill a man in the space of a heartbeat if it let go under pressure, and the old boiler man tested every seam and rivet and new rolled tube twice, and then a third time for good measure. They filled her cold and watched a full day for the smallest weep. They built the pressure up slow by hand and held it, and watched the gauge needle for the least tremble of a fault. Twice they found a fault and drained her all the way down and started the whole business over, and each time Harlan felt the town's laughter at his back like a cold draft coming in under a door. Money grew thin as creek ice in April. New copper and brass and fittings for a machine 60 years out of the world did not come cheap, and more than once Ada Beck went without some small thing she had wanted so the engine could have something it needed. She never once said a word in complaint. Make her worth it was the whole of what she ever said on the matter, and Harlan fully meant to. Then, on a cool, clear morning, at the very tail end of that wet spring, quietly and with no one watching but the two of them, they judged her ready to try. They wheeled her out of the barn and into the good light. They laid a careful fire in her belly and lit it, and for the first time in 30 years, a ribbon of smoke rose up out of the tall black stack and drifted off into the Colwyn County sky. Grady watched the water glass and the pressure gauge like a hawk hung over a stubble field. The needle crept. The old iron began to tick and pop as the long dead heat woke inside it. And then, deep down in the belly of her, the water began to sing, and a soft white plume of live steam hissed up along the boiler and stood trembling in the morning air. Grady Shaw took off his cap and held it against his chest. "She breathed," he said, very low, and there was not one trace of laughter left anywhere in the old boiler man's face. "I will be damned for a liar. She breathed." Word of that got out, too, the way such word always does. And so it happened that when the county held its summer muster down on the fairgrounds, the big yearly celebration, the whole of Colwyn County turned out in its Sunday best under the flags. Harlan Beck asked, plain and quiet, for the chance to show the people what $45 had bought. They gave it to him, mostly for the joke they still believed it to be. Ned Harmon, a broad, ruddy fire captain with a gray mustache and a brass-buttoned coat, agreed to let the old relic take a turn at the water throwing after the modern pumper trucks had shown off their steel, and Harlan strongly suspected the captain expected to be hauling a sputtering wreck off the field before the band struck up again. The crowd that gathered to watch had gathered mostly to see him fail. Dale Corbin, a man in his 50s in a warm mustard-tan jacket and dark trousers, stood near the front of it, arms folded across his chest, that same ready grin half-formed on his face. They had fired her early that morning, and by the time her turn came around she was up to full pressure and trembling with it, the tall stack breathing hard and steady. The polished brass throwing the summer sunlight back so bright it hurt a body to look straight at her. Grady Shaw stood ready at the pump. Harlan Beck laid his hand one last time on the warm brass rail, looked out over the packed and waiting field, and then he opened the valve. For half of 1 second, nothing at all happened, and in that half a second you could hear the whole crowd draw its breath and hold it, already leaning toward the laugh. Then the old steam pump caught and slammed and caught again, and the great canvas hose leapt rigid and alive in the hands of the men who braced it, and a solid white column of water tore out of the brass nozzle and climbed and did not stop its climbing. It went up past the tops of the fairground poles. It went up past the snapping flag on its staff. It arched clean over the whole of the field and came down glittering in the sun like a hard, bright summer rain. And somewhere down in the roar of it, a woman began to cheer, and then, all at once, every last one of them did. 90 feet, if it was an inch, straight up into the deep blue, exactly the way the old-timer at the auction had sworn on his life that she once could. The modern trucks had thrown a good strong stream that afternoon, and everyone had clapped for them politely. Not one of them had thrown it half so high. And Dale Corbin stood there at the very front of that cheering crowd with his folded arms fallen loose to his sides and his mouth come open the exact way it had hung open in the muddy auction yard, and yet nothing at all like it. There was no scorn anywhere left in his face. He was watching the machine that had failed his family throw water into the summer sky at last, 30 years too late and somehow right on time, and the tears were running plain down into his collar, and he did not lift a hand to hide a one of them. Harlan Beck found him afterward, off apart from the crowd, standing quiet by the cooling engine with one hand come to rest on her warm brass rail. For a good while neither man said a thing. There did not seem to be a need for it. "I was on the hose that night," Dale said at last. "The mill. I always did figure her for junk after. It was easier figuring it that way. She was not junk," Harlan said. "She was just forgotten. Somebody let her go, a little at a time, until there was nothing left to hold. That was not her fault. And it surely was not yours." Dale Corbin nodded slow and wiped his face with the flat of his hand and looked up at the tall, clean stack standing against the blue. $45, he said, and this time there was not one grain of a laugh left in it, only a kind of quiet wonder. You got the bargain of the whole century, Harlan. The little yellow auction tag was still tied to the brass rail, right where Amos Pell had knotted it that muddy morning. The ink of it faded now, but the number on it still plain to read, $45. Harlan had left it there on purpose, all through the long work of the winter, and he left it there for good. No longer the mark of shame the town had meant it for, but a badge, the honest price of the finest thing he ever did. They gave the old engine a place of honor after that day in a clean, dry shed at the edge of the fairgrounds where the families of Weatherby could come and stand and look at her, brass gleaming, boiler black, and proud. The tall brass bell that had hung green and silent for a whole lifetime, now polished bright and ringing clear across the grounds every 4th of July. The barn shingle that had said scrap went into Harlan's cook stove that first cold evening and made a good, brief, deeply satisfying little fire. Nobody in Colwyn County ever called Harlan Beck a fool again. And nobody ever again called the great steam engine scrap. She had been bought one time, long ago, out of the nickels and dimes of a grateful town, to be their guardian and their promise against the dark. It had taken 60 years, one stubborn man in bib overalls, a cantankerous old boiler man, and 45 hard dollars. But in the end, she kept her word. She threw water 90 feet into the wide Colwyn County sky, and every last person who had ever laughed at her stood silent in the grass and watched her do it.